I always believed New Year's Eve was meant to bring warmth, unity, and hope. I still carried those old images in my heart. My late wife and I decorating the tree, my children laughing as I read them stories before the countdown, the smell of hot chocolate and pine needles filling our small home. But this year, everything was different. I carried a worn suitcase in one hand, filled with little presents I had bought for my grandchildren and a pie I had baked myself. My heart beat faster with anticipation. I longed for that cozy family atmosphere that had been slipping away from me in recent years. The streets glistened under fresh snow, the lampposts glowing softly, making the city feel like a fairy tale. I imagined my grandchildren running up to me with joy, hugging me, asking about the gifts. I imagined us sitting together, raising glasses at midnight, wishing for a better year ahead. Yet deep down, I carried a seed of worry. Lately, my son and his wife had been treating me as though I were just an unwanted guest in their lives. When I finally reached their house, it was dazzling with lights and decorations. Music and laughter spilled out through the frosted windows. I could smell roasted turkey, hear the clinking of glasses, and see silhouettes moving inside. My chest warmed at the thought of stepping in and joining them. I rang the bell. After a moment, the door opened, and there stood my daughter-in-law. She looked radiant in her glittering dress, a champagne glass in her hand, but her eyes were sharp and cold. Her smile didn't reach them. "Oh, you came," she said flatly. "Of course. It's New Year's Eve," I answered with a hopeful smile. I wanted to be with family. She didn't move to let me in. Instead, she shifted, blocking the doorway. Behind her, I could see my grandchildren dancing by the tree, giggling as they tossed tinsel at each other. My throat tightened. "This party is for the young," she said with a little shrug. "We didn't plan for extra guests." I gripped the handle of my suitcase tighter. "I just want to give the children their gifts. It won't take long." She shook her head. "No, it's better if you go home. They're happy without disruptions." I stared at her, stunned. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. From inside, I heard my son's voice calling, "Who's at the door?" And in that moment, as she turned to answer him, I realized that this night, this holiday I had cherished for decades, was about to become the loneliest one of my life. The laughter inside the house cut through me like glass. I could see the silhouettes of my grandchildren, spinning and twirling under the glow of the Christmas tree. Their tiny voices, full of joy, were like echoes from a life that no longer belonged to me. I tightened my grip on the suitcase, still heavy with gifts I had chosen so carefully, small toy trains, a book of fairy tales, knitted scarves I had made with my own clumsy hands during the long winter evenings. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. Maybe just let the children step outside for a minute. I only want to wish them a happy new year." My daughter-in-law's eyes narrowed, her smile cutting like a knife. "They don't need interruptions. They're happy in there. Why would you ruin their mood?" The words stung, sharper than the cold wind that bit at my cheeks. For a moment, I couldn't find my voice. My chest ached as though the frosty air itself had frozen my heart. And then, from inside, I heard the familiar voice of my son. "Who's at the door?" She turned her head, her shoulders lifting in a dismissive shrug. "Your father. I told him we're full tonight. He's not needed." The door opened wider, and there he was, my son, dressed in a tailored suit, champagne in hand, his face flushed with warmth and pride. He looked at me the way a stranger might look at a beggar who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice not harsh, but heavy with irritation. I swallowed hard. "It's New Year's Eve, son. I brought gifts for the children, a pie. I thought we could." He sighed, glancing back over his shoulder where music and laughter swelled. "We didn't plan for you this year. It's nothing personal, but it's better this way." Nothing personal. The words hit me harder than any insult could. For him, it was easier to cast me aside than to welcome me into the warmth of his home. Behind him, I caught sight of my grandson lifting a glass of sparkling juice, raising it toward the ceiling. My granddaughter clapped her hands, her eyes sparkling with innocence. They didn't know I was there. They didn't know their grandfather was standing in the cold, his feet numbing against the frozen porch. My son shifted, lowering his voice. "Dad, you should go? Don't make this harder. We'll talk some other time." His hand moved to close the door. My throat tightened, my words caught between pride and desperation. For a moment, I wanted to beg, to ask him why, to remind him of the years I had carried him on my shoulders, the nights I had stayed awake to calm his fevers, the mornings I had left for work before sunrise to keep food on the table. But all that history seemed to have evaporated, replaced by glittering lights, champagne toasts, and the shallow comfort of forgetting where you came from. The door began to close, and the golden warmth of the house grew smaller, dimmer, until only a sliver of light cut through the darkness. Then, with a soft click, I was left outside. Alone. Snowflakes drifted down onto my shoulders. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the icicles that clung to the roof. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door that had once opened to me without hesitation. Slowly, I turned and walked back down the steps, my suitcase heavy in my hand, my breath hanging in the air like smoke. Each step echoed in the silence of the street. The countdown had already begun inside. 5, 4, 3. But out here, there was no celebration. Only the lonely crunch of snow beneath my boots. And in that moment, as fireworks cracked in the distance, I knew something had changed forever. The fireworks had barely faded when the silence hit me like a stone. The night was cold, cruel even, but what froze me more was the thought that my own blood had shut me out without hesitation. I stood there on the empty street, staring at the glowing windows that framed a life I no longer belonged to. I started walking. Each step was slow, my boots crunching against the snow, the suitcase dragging at my side like a weight tied to my soul. I could hear echoes of laughter spilling through the frosted glass, voices counting down to a year I wasn't welcome to enter. For them, the new beginning had already started. For me, it felt like an ending. I thought of the past New Year's Eves. My wife, God rest her soul, used to fuss over every detail. The food, the decorations, even the silly paper hats we would wear at midnight. She made everything feel magical, even when money was tight. She had a gift for weaving love into the simplest things. And now she was gone. The warmth had gone with her. And all that was left was me, an old man standing alone in the snow, clutching gifts no one wanted. My feet carried me back toward my small house on the edge of town. The streets were deserted, everyone tucked into celebrations. In the distance, the church bells chimed midnight. I paused for a moment, looking up at the night sky as bursts of red and gold fireworks painted the horizon. For a fleeting second, I whispered, "Happy New Year, my love." When I arrived home, the silence was unbearable. The house felt too big, too empty. I set the suitcase down on the table and opened it. The gifts looked back at me, wrapped neatly with ribbons, carrying a hope that had been rejected at the doorstep. My throat tightened as I ran my hands over the pie I had baked. It was still warm, though cooling quickly. I imagined my grandchildren's faces if they had tasted it, their sticky fingers grabbing at slices while they laughed. I sank into the chair, staring at the untouched feast. My hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the weight of what had happened. A man can live through poverty, through hardship, through loss. But to be erased by his own family? That wound cut deeper than anything I had ever endured. Still, somewhere inside me, a spark remained. A whisper of defiance, a reminder that I was not just an old man to be cast aside. I had lived too long, worked too hard, and sacrificed too much to let them treat me like nothing. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, and for the first time that night, a thought settled in my mind, quiet, steady, and dangerous. If they believed I was no longer part of their lives, perhaps it was time to show them exactly what that meant. The night after New Year's felt endless. I lay in bed, but sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, my son's look of irritation, my daughter-in-law's cold smile, the warm glow of the house shutting me out while I stood like an outsider in the snow. By morning, the pie was still untouched on the table. The gifts, wrapped in bright paper, seemed almost mocking now. I thought about unwrapping them, using them for myself. But no, they weren't meant for me. They were a promise I had tried to keep, and my own family had rejected it. I spent that first day of the year in silence, moving through the motions of life. I boiled water for tea, swept the floor, mended an old jacket. But every little task felt heavy. I couldn't escape the question ringing in my mind. How could they do this to me? The second day, I forced myself out into town. People greeted me with cheer, neighbors wishing Happy New Year, shopkeepers smiling. They didn't know what had happened. To them, I was just another old man starting another year. I nodded and smiled back, but inside, I felt like a hollow shell. Yet, as I walked past the town square, something stirred in me. I saw families together, fathers lifting their children onto their shoulders, grandparents holding little hands as kids tugged at sparklers. For a moment, bitterness rose in my chest. Why did they get to keep their bonds, their warmth, while mine had been stripped away? I returned home, sat at my kitchen table, and stared at my reflection in the darkened window. Wrinkles, gray hair, tired eyes, but behind them, a spark still flickered. A thought began to take root. If they see me as nothing, then perhaps I should remind them who I am. I had lived a life of sacrifice. I had built my son's foundation, worked double shifts, paid for his education, helped him buy his first car, even lent him money to start his business. And now he shut the door in my face as though I had never mattered. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the table. The quiet of my house pressed around me, but inside my mind, something shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was resolve. They thought they could erase me from their story, but I wasn't finished. And as that realization settled into my bones, I knew that my silence would not be eternal. Somewhere, somehow, they would learn the weight of the man they had cast aside. The days after New Year's blurred together like long, gray shadows. Outside, the streets still shone with decorations. Strings of lights twinkled across the lampposts. Children played in the snowbanks, their laughter carrying through the crisp winter air. But inside me, something darker had taken root. It wasn't the kind of anger that shouted or demanded. No, mine was quieter, colder, like a river that carved stone, steady and unstoppable. Every morning, on my way to the market, I passed by their house. I never stopped, but I always slowed. I saw the cars parked neatly in the driveway, expensive ones gleaming even under layers of snow. I heard the muffled sounds of music and laughter leaking through the walls. Sometimes I caught sight of my grandchildren through the window, playing with new toys, their little hands clutching things I had not given them. To the outside world, my son's family was perfect. Wealthy, happy, respected. Neighbors adored them, speaking of their generosity, their elegance, their perfect family. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that behind the glow of those windows was a son who had slammed the door on the very man who had once sacrificed everything to make that life possible. That word haunted me. Everything. I had given up everything for him. I remembered the winters when he was small and his shoes had holes in the soles. I patched them up with scraps, using twine and glue, so he wouldn't have to walk with wet socks. I remembered the nights I stayed awake with him when fever burned his little body, cooling his forehead with damp towels, whispering promises that he'd grow strong. I remembered when he wanted to study in college, and I sold my tools, my pride, to pay his tuition. He never knew how it broke me to give up the instruments of my trade. Later, when he dreamed of starting his company, I mortgaged my modest home so he could have the money to begin. My hands bled for years in labor so that he could live free of the weight I had carried. And now, I wasn't even worth a chair at his table. That thought clawed at me as I sat one evening at my old desk. In front of me lay an aged wooden box, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. I lifted the lid, and inside were papers, yellowed bank slips, faded receipts, loan agreements, letters written long ago. Each one was a fragment of my sacrifice, evidence of the years I had poured into his future. I spread them out carefully on the desk, my hands trembling not from weakness, but from the storm gathering inside me. I traced the lines of numbers and signatures, reminders of the blood and sweat that had built the foundation of my son's so-called success. Here was proof, in black ink, that the life he paraded before the neighbors had not been conjured out of his brilliance alone. It had been born out of my sacrifice. As I stared at those papers, something hardened in me. They thought they had erased me, that I was a relic to be forgotten, shut out of their glowing house like a shadow. But these documents, these memories, they were my voice. And one day, that voice would echo so loudly they would not be able to ignore it. My revenge would not come in shouting or in anger. No plates smashed, no screams in the night. My revenge would be quieter, more patient. A silence so strong it would break them from within. That night, I gathered the papers, tied them with twine, and returned them to the box. As I did, I whispered into the empty room. They think the new year belongs to them. But this year will be mine. And for the first time since standing on that frozen porch, I felt something close to peace. Not the peace of forgiveness, but the peace of certainty. A storm had begun, and I would be its architect. The winter days dragged on, but I no longer drifted through them like a ghost. Something had shifted inside me after I tied up that box of documents. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't invisible. The years of sacrifice had carved me into something harder than stone. I began to watch quietly. Observation had always been one of my strengths. Years of working with my hands, fixing things, building things, taught me patience. My son thought I was old and slow, but he didn't realize that stillness can be sharper than movement. From a distance, I started noticing cracks in his perfect life. His company, the one I had nearly broken myself to fund, wasn't as stable as he made it seem. I heard whispers at the market, saw headlines in the local paper about debts piling up in certain businesses. His name wasn't printed, but I recognized the signs. He had been living beyond his means for years, throwing parties, buying expensive cars, hosting dinners where neighbors fawned over his wealth. I knew the numbers, better than he did, perhaps, because I had once taught him how to count every penny. One afternoon, while passing his house, I paused longer than usual. Through the frosted window, I caught sight of him arguing with his wife. Her jeweled fingers jabbed the air, her face twisted in anger. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. Even from across the street, I could read the tension in his body. Something wasn't right. And though they had turned me away, though they had told me I was nothing, a grim satisfaction warmed me. Their glittering world wasn't invincible. That night, I sat again at my desk with the box of papers. I opened it slowly, as though unlocking the past itself. Each slip of paper was a reminder that their success had been born out of my sacrifices. Bank slips, loan receipts, the signed mortgage agreement, evidence that without me, none of their perfect life would exist. But my revenge wouldn't be as simple as showing these papers to the world. That would be too loud, too quick. No, what I imagined was different. I wanted them to feel the same weight I had felt standing on that porch, shut out, humiliated, powerless. And I knew just how to begin. The next morning, I made my way to the town hall. The clerks still remembered me. I had lived here my whole life, paid my taxes on time, shaken their hands at every community gathering. A smile here, a kind word there, and soon I was flipping through public records. My son's name appeared more than once. Loans, contracts, obligations. He had stretched himself thin. All it would take was the right nudge, the right silence, and his empire would begin to crack. I walked home slowly that evening, my breath curling in the freezing air, but my mind sharp as a blade. They thought the new year was theirs. They thought I was forgotten. But I had patience, and patience was a weapon sharper than pride. I placed the documents back in their box, ran my hand over the rough wooden lid, and whispered into the empty room. You closed the door on me. Now I will watch you open the door to ruin. And with that, I blew out the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but inside me, a strange light had begun to burn. January stretched on, cold and relentless, but for me it no longer felt empty. I had a purpose again. Each day was another step in a quiet game only I knew was being played. I didn't strike all at once. No, that wasn't my way. My revenge wasn't a storm that crashed suddenly. It was frost creeping slowly across a window pane, spreading inch by inch until everything was covered. The first move came almost by accident. At the market one morning, I overheard two men talking near the butcher's stall. They were discussing a delayed payment from my son's company. They laughed, shaking their heads. One said, "For a man who throws such big parties, he sure doesn't pay on time." I didn't join the conversation, but the words settled in me like kindling waiting for a spark. My son's image in the community was polished, perfect. But if suppliers were whispering, if debts were piling, then his mask was already slipping. Later that week, I walked past his house again. This time, the music wasn't playing and the laughter was gone. Instead, I heard raised voices, my son's sharp tone cutting through the cold evening air, his wife's shrill reply bouncing back like broken glass. I slowed my pace, pausing in the shadows. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw them, her face red with anger, his hand pressed to his forehead, pacing like a trapped animal. My lips curled into a thin smile. Cracks. small now, but they would widen. Back at home, I opened my wooden box of documents once more. My hands moved carefully, smoothing each page flat. Mortgage slips, old loans, receipts. They were more than paper. They were a weapon, sharpened by years of silence. But I wouldn't wield it carelessly. No, timing was everything. If I moved too soon, they might patch the cracks. But if I waited, if I let the pressure build, the collapse would be inevitable. Still, I couldn't just sit idly. So I began to visit people, quietly, like an old man with too much time on his hands. A chat with a neighbor at the post office, a word with a shopkeeper, a question to a clerk at the bank. I never mentioned my son directly. I didn't need to. All I had to do was listen. And listening, I learned more than he would ever admit. Late payments, nervous investors, a reputation beginning to tarnish beneath the surface. At night, I would return home, sit by the dim light of my lamp, and think. Sometimes the loneliness still pressed heavy on me, the memory of being turned away at the door burning deep. But then I reminded myself, patience, silence, those were my allies. One evening, I stood at my window, watching snow fall under the streetlight. I whispered to the night, as though speaking to my late wife. They think I'm forgotten. They think I'm weak. But soon, they'll learn what it means to cast me aside. The house was quiet around me, but in that silence, I felt powerful. For the first time in years, I wasn't drifting. I was waiting, and the cracks in their perfect world were already beginning to spread. The first weeks of January began to strip away the glitter of the holidays. Neighbors took down their decorations, leaving streets bare and gray. But for me, the cold air felt sharper, clearer, like a mirror reflecting the truth. My son's perfect life was beginning to unravel. At the market, I caught more whispers. The butcher muttered about unpaid bills. The grocer sighed about delays from one of his wealthy clients. They never said his name outright, but the pieces fit together too neatly. Every word was a small confirmation that the cracks were spreading. One afternoon, I deliberately took a longer path home, circling past his office downtown. The lights were still on though it was late, and through the glass I could see him at his desk. His suit jacket was tossed over a chair, his tie loose, his face buried in his hands. He looked smaller somehow, not the proud man who had slammed the door on me, but someone weighed down by debts and decisions he couldn't control. A strange mix of emotions stirred inside me. Pity, satisfaction, even grief. But I held on to one truth. This was not my doing. Not yet. This was the weight of his own choices pressing down. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to make him feel what I had felt on that frozen porch. That evening, I sat again with my wooden box of papers. I spread the documents across the table, arranging them like puzzle pieces. Receipts of money transferred, proof of loans I had signed for him, the mortgage agreement with my name beside his. They were more than faded sheets of paper. They were the skeleton of his empire. And I was the one who had given it flesh. I thought of the neighbors who praised him, of the way they spoke of his generosity at church, of how they admired the parties he hosted. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know the foundation of their golden family story was built on the back of the man they had exiled from their table. I ran my hand over the papers, whispering to myself, one day they will see. One day they will know. The silence in my house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt purposeful. The loneliness was still there, yes, but it was sharpened into something I could use. My patience became my weapon. Late that night, as snow fell softly outside, I lit a single candle and placed it beside the box. Its glow flickered across the documents, shadows stretching like long fingers across the wood. In that quiet light, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't rush. I wouldn't lash out. I would let time do the work for me. Because time, I had learned, is the cruelest weapon of all. And when the moment came, when the cracks in his world could no longer be hidden, I would be there, silent but unshakable, a reminder of everything they had tried to erase. By mid-February, the shine had worn off their holiday glow. The neighborhood still remembered the grand New Year's Eve party my son had thrown, the champagne that flowed, the fireworks that lit the sky. But whispers had begun to replace admiration. Neighbors talked in hushed voices. Shopkeepers raised eyebrows. Even the pastor at church hinted that not all was as perfect as it seemed. I didn't have to search for the rumors. They found me. At the bakery, two women gossiped over loaves of bread. Did you hear? His last payment bounced. Imagine, with all that wealth. At the barber's, men laughed quietly. He flaunts his cars, but can't pay his suppliers on time. I pretended not to listen, but each word sank into me like drops of rain into dry soil. His reputation was crumbling, and I watched silently, a shadow on the edge of their world. One cold evening, I passed his house again. No music this time, no warm laughter spilling into the street. The windows glowed, but the light seemed dimmer, strained. I slowed my pace, hidden by the frost-covered branches. Inside, my son paced the living room, his phone pressed tight to his ear, his gestures sharp, frantic. His wife sat rigid on the couch, her face pale with anger, her arms folded like iron bars across her chest. Even from outside, I could feel the tension crackling through the air like static. My lips curved into a thin smile. It wasn't joy I felt. No, it was something deeper, darker. It was recognition. They were beginning to taste the isolation they had fed me. That night, I returned to my own quiet home and opened my wooden box again. I spread the papers across the table, the evidence of every sacrifice I had made. Mortgage slips, bank transfers, signed agreements. My fingerprints were all over his success, though he would never admit it. Without me, his empire would never have been born. And now, as it trembled on unsteady legs, I felt no urge to prop it up. Instead, I whispered into the silence. This is only the beginning. The following week, the cracks widened. I heard from a friend at the post office that investors were pulling back. Suppliers were demanding cash up front. The word unstable began to circulate like a disease. My son's name, once spoken with respect, now carried a note of doubt. And I did nothing. That was the most powerful part. I didn't confront him, didn't reveal my box of papers, didn't storm into his home with accusations. I simply waited. Because I knew the deeper the cracks spread, the more devastating the collapse would be. And when the collapse came, they would remember the night they left me in the cold. By late February, the whispers had turned into conversations, and the conversations were turning into headlines. My son's company, his pride, his symbol of success, was beginning to buckle under the weight of debts he could no longer hide. I first saw the crack in public at the town's business gala. I wasn't invited, of course. I hadn't been welcome at such gatherings for years. But small towns have a way of carrying news quickly, and that night the news came to me like fire spreading through dry grass. Neighbors spoke about how my son had arrived late, his suit wrinkled, his wife's smile strained and brittle. He had raised a glass to toast his prosperous year, but the room was filled with forced laughter. Everyone already knew. Suppliers had withdrawn, clients had left, investors were asking questions. And then came the humiliation. His credit card declined at the very table where he sat surrounded by colleagues. The whispers turned to smirks, and those smirks spread faster than fire. When I heard it, I didn't gloat. No loud cheer escaped me, no satisfaction painted across my face. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, hands folded over my wooden box, and let the silence seep into me. The world was doing what I could never have done with words alone. They were dismantling the pedestal my son had built for himself, piece by piece, until he stood exposed. The following day, I passed his house again. This time, the curtains were drawn. No music, no laughter, no neighbors pulling up in cars with gifts of wine. Just silence, heavy and cold, the kind of silence that presses down on a house like a storm cloud. For the first time in weeks, I dared to pause in front of his gate. I looked at the grand house, its lights dim, its walls no longer glowing with joy, and I thought of the night they had shut me out. I remembered the sting of rejection, the feel of snow settling on my shoulders while they raised glasses in warmth. And now? Now the warmth had left them too. That evening, as I sat with the documents spread before me, I traced my fingers over the lines of ink. Every signature, every number was a thread tying me to their lives. They had tried to erase me, to cast me into the cold. But the truth was unavoidable. Their rise had been built on me, and their fall would not escape me either. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the flicker of the candle beside me, and whispered, "This is how silence speaks." And though my house was quiet, I felt no loneliness. For the first time, I felt powerful. Because in their downfall, I could finally hear my own voice again. The fall of my son's image was no longer a rumor, it was fact. By early March, the entire town knew he was drowning in debt. His investors had grown cautious, his partners restless, and the once constant stream of admirers who came to his house with gifts and praise had dried up entirely. The mansion that once pulsed with laughter and light now looked more like a fortress under siege. Curtains stayed closed. Cars rarely moved from the driveway. Even the children, once cheerful in the yard, no longer played outside. I watched it unfold with the patience of a man who had nothing but time. For weeks, I kept my silence, carrying groceries, nodding to neighbors, never speaking of the storm I knew was raging behind those walls. But everywhere I went, people brought it to me. At the cafe, the waitress leaned in with wide eyes. "Did you hear? His card was declined again, right in front of a client." At church, a friend whispered, "They say he's selling off assets quietly to stay afloat." At the market, the grocer smirked. "Funny how fast people fall when their money runs out." And each time, I only nodded, lips pressed together, my heart a mixture of sorrow and satisfaction. One afternoon, as I passed their house, I slowed. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw my son at the dining table, his head in his hands, papers spread in front of him. His wife stood nearby, her face twisted with fury, waving her arms as she spoke. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the blame in every gesture, the desperation in every line of her body. I lingered only a moment, then walked on. But inside, I felt something shift. It wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was something heavier, deeper. They were beginning to taste what I had tasted on New Year's Eve, the cold of rejection, the sting of humiliation, the silence of doors closing. That evening, I lit a candle and placed it beside my wooden box of documents. I spread the papers across the table as though laying out a map. Each slip of paper was a road that led back to me. Mortgages, loans, payments, proof that their empire had been built on my back. For years, they had pretended otherwise. But the truth was here, in my hands, undeniable. I whispered to the empty house, "You may have erased me from your table, but you cannot erase the truth of what I gave." The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the documents. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine the next step, not merely waiting for their downfall, but guiding it, not out of cruelty, but out of justice, because the world had already begun to turn against them. And when the storm finally consumed them, I would be there, not as the forgotten old man they had exiled, but as the shadow they could not escape. And though I sat alone in my small kitchen, I felt far from powerless. It was mid-March when the silence around their house finally broke. For weeks, I had seen nothing but drawn curtains and dim lights. But one evening, as I returned from the market, I noticed a car idling outside their gate. Not a neighbor, not a guest, something else. A banker, perhaps, or a man from the law. Whoever it was, he didn't stay long. 10 minutes later, he drove away, leaving my son standing in the doorway with his shoulders sagging, his wife glaring daggers into his back. The next day, the whispers reached me before the morning sun had climbed above the rooftops. Their business was collapsing. Creditors were circling. Some said they might even lose the house. I listened quietly, as I always did, but this time the words stirred something different in me. Not pity, not yet, but a shift, like the turning of a tide. 2 days later, it happened. I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking tea, when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps against the wood of my door. For a moment, I didn't move. Few people visited me anymore, and the rhythm of that knock, it carried urgency, not warmth. When I opened the door, there stood my son. His hair was unkempt, his suit wrinkled, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Behind him, in the fading light, I saw the shape of his wife waiting by the car, her face pale and sour, as though she'd been forced to come here against her will. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The memory of New Year's Eve slammed into me, the door closing in my face, the cold seeping into my bones as their laughter rang out behind the glass. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Dad, we need to talk." His voice cracked on the last word, the weight of humiliation heavy on his tongue. I didn't invite him in immediately. I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I wanted him to feel the weight of standing on the threshold, not knowing if he'd be welcomed or turned away. Perhaps for the first time, he felt what I had felt on that bitter night. At last, I stepped aside. "Come in," I said, my voice steady but cold. He sat at my table, his hands trembling as he gripped a cup of tea I had placed before him. He didn't drink. His eyes darted across the room, landing on the wooden box in the corner. I followed his gaze but said nothing. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, I need help. Things aren't going well. You've probably heard." I said nothing, only watched him. His voice was raw, stripped of pride. "We're losing everything. The business, the house. I don't know what to do. I know I haven't been," he swallowed hard. "I haven't been a good son. But please, the kids, they don't deserve this." For a moment, I felt the sting of sympathy. I thought of my grandchildren, their bright eyes and laughter. They were innocent. But then the memory returned. The feel of snow on my shoulders, the sound of the door shutting in my face, the words, "There's no place for you here." I leaned back in my chair, my eyes fixed on him. He shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. The silence stretched, heavy, deliberate. At last, I said softly, "Now you know what it feels like to be left out in the cold." His eyes flickered with shame. And for the first time, I saw fear in him, not of losing his business, but of losing me. The silence that followed my words was heavy, almost unbearable. My son sat across from me, his shoulders hunched, his fingers tapping nervously against the wooden table. He had come to me not as the confident, polished man who once closed a door in my face, but as a desperate soul stripped of his pride. I watched him, letting the stillness work its way into his bones, letting him feel what I had felt that bitter night on New Year's Eve when I stood in the snow with gifts no one wanted. Finally, he spoke again, his voice breaking. "Dad, I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But I didn't think," he paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't think it would come to this. I need your help. Please." His words hung in the air like frost. I leaned forward slowly, folding my hands on the table. "Do you know what you asked me for on New Year's Eve?" I asked quietly. He blinked, confused. I told you not to come." I said. "You told me there was no place for me in your life anymore." My voice was calm, but sharp as ice. "And now you sit here, asking for a place at my table." He flinched, as if the words themselves had struck him. For a moment, he looked like a boy again, ashamed, guilty, caught in a lie he couldn't defend. Behind the door, I heard his wife shifting impatiently in the car. I imagined her scowling, her pride wounded by the thought of her husband begging his old father for help. That image almost made me smile. My son lowered his head. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I can't do this alone. Everything is slipping away. The business, the house, the kids will suffer." For a moment, my heart stirred at the mention of my grandchildren. I thought of their laughter, their small hands tugging at ribbons, the way their eyes had glowed under the Christmas tree. They were innocent, untouched by their parents' cruelty, and they did not deserve the storm that now threatened to swallow their lives. But I did not let my son see that flicker of softness. Instead, I sat back, my gaze steady and unyielding. "Do you know what's in that box?" I asked, nodding toward the wooden chest in the corner. His eyes followed my gesture. For a moment, his breath caught. He had seen it before, years ago, when I had shown him the papers as he signed his first loan. But back then, he hadn't cared. He hadn't understood. "That box," I continued, "holds every sacrifice I made for you. Every coin I scraped together, every loan I signed, every debt I carried so you could stand where you are now. And you thought you could erase me with one slammed door." Tears glimmered in his eyes, though he tried to hide them. His hands trembled as he whispered. I was proud. Too proud. I thought I could do it alone. But I was wrong. I let his confession hang in the air. I wanted him to feel the weight of every second, to understand that words alone could not undo years of disregard. Finally, I leaned closer, my voice low, steady, unshakable. "I don't need your apology. What I need is for you to understand. You built your life on the foundation of my hands. You forgot that. And now, when the walls are crumbling, you come back to the one stone that still holds firm." He nodded weakly, unable to meet my gaze. For the first time, I saw not just my son, but a man broken by the same silence he had forced upon me. And I realized, this was not the end of my revenge. It was only the beginning. The words I had spoken lingered in the air long after they left my lips. My son sat at the table, pale and defeated, his hands gripping the edge as though the wood itself could hold him upright. For years he had carried himself like a man above everyone else. Confident, admired, untouchable. Now he looked like a boy again, stripped of all defenses, forced to face the truth he had buried for so long. I studied him in silence. Silence had always been my weapon, my companion. On New Year's Eve, it was forced upon me as I stood alone in the snow. Tonight, it was deliberate, heavy, and suffocating. I let him squirm under it. Finally, he broke. "Dad, I'll do anything. I just can't lose everything. Not the business, not the house, not the kid's future." The desperation in his voice was real, but it came too late. Where was this humility when he shut the door in my face? Where was this fear when he told me there was no place for me in his life anymore? I leaned back, folding my arms, my voice measured. "Everything you fear losing now was built on what I sacrificed. And yet, you thought I was disposable. You thought I was nothing." His eyes darted to the wooden box in the corner. He knew what was in there: documents, receipts, the undeniable evidence of my hand in his success. For years he had buried that knowledge beneath pride. Now, the sight of that box seemed to weigh on him heavier than his debts. "I didn't mean to erase you," he whispered. "I was proud and foolish." I almost laughed. Not out of joy, but bitterness. Didn't mean to erase me? Pride wasn't an excuse. Pride had been the wall that kept me outside while my grandchildren laughed inside. Pride had been the knife that cut me away from the family I built. But still, when he said the word kids, something twisted in me. My grandchildren. They were innocent. They hadn't chosen this. They hadn't told me to leave that night. They hadn't slammed the door. And though I ached to punish their parents, I couldn't ignore the small faces that still lit up my memories. I let out a long breath. "What is it you're asking of me?" His eyes lifted, hopeful for the first time. "Money. Connections. Anything. You've always known people who still respect you. If you could just—" I raised a hand to stop him. "Respect," I said quietly. "Respect doesn't come from wealth. Respect is earned by how you treat the people who gave you life. And tell me, do you think you earn mine?" His lips trembled. He had no answer. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Finally, I rose from my chair, walked to the corner, and laid my hand on the wooden box. His eyes followed me, wide, desperate. "Everything in this box is proof that you owe your life to me," I said softly. "But whether I use it to help you or to remind you of what you've done, that is my decision, not yours." I carried the box back to the table and set it down between us. His gaze fixed on it like a drowning man staring at a rope. But I didn't open it. I let it sit there, heavy, unspoken, a barrier of truth he could no longer deny. For the first time in years, the balance of power had shifted. I was no longer the man left out in the cold. I was the man holding the key to his future or his ruin. And the choice of what came next belonged to me. The box sat between us like a living thing, heavy with years of sacrifice, silence, and truth. My son's eyes clung to it as though it contained his salvation, yet he didn't dare reach for it. He knew better now. The balance had shifted. I traced my fingers slowly across the wood, feeling the grooves worn into it over decades. Memories pressed into me. The nights I had labored with bleeding hands, the mornings I had left before dawn to earn a wage, the evenings when I held him as a sick child and whispered that everything would be all right. All of those years, all of those sacrifices locked inside this box. Finally, I looked at him. "You left me outside in the cold," I said softly. "You made me feel as though I had no worth, no place in your world. And now you sit here, asking for the same man you cast away to save you." His shoulders slumped, shame carved into his features. "I was wrong," he whispered. "I see it now. I see how blind I was. Please, Dad, I'll never make that mistake again." For a long moment, I only watched him. The silence between us felt endless. And in that silence, I realized something profound. True revenge had already happened. He had lived to see the world strip him of his pride. He had been brought low not by my hand, but by his own choices, his own arrogance. And now, humbled, he came crawling back to the man he thought he had outgrown. I could have destroyed him completely. The documents in the box were proof enough to ruin whatever remained of his reputation. But I thought of my grandchildren, their bright eyes, their laughter. They did not deserve to grow up in the ruins of their parents' mistakes. I closed the box with a decisive thud. His head jerked up at the sound, his breath caught. "I will not give you money," I said. "I will not bail you out. You will face the consequences of your choices. But I will not let my grandchildren go hungry. For them, I will help in my way. For them, not for you." Tears welled in his eyes, though he tried to hold them back. He nodded, understanding the distinction, the weight of my words. I rose from the table, carrying the box back to its place in the corner. My voice was steady as I spoke again. You wanted me erased, but I am still here, and you will never forget it. When he left that night, he did not slam the door. He did not walk with pride. He walked slowly, shoulders bent, as though the weight of the world pressed down on him. His wife glared at me from the car, her pride still unbroken, but even she looked smaller, diminished. As the car drove away, I stood at my doorway, the cold wind brushing against my face. For the first time since that bitter night on New Year's Eve, I did not feel alone. I felt victorious, not because I had shouted, not because I had struck back with fury, but because my silence, my patience, my very presence had spoken louder than their rejection ever could. They had left me out in the cold, but in the end, it was I who held the warmth they could never regain. And as I closed the door, the quiet of my home wrapped around me, not empty, not heavy, but powerful. Because the greatest revenge is not destruction. It is being remembered.